Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Herskowitz. I'm the Artistic and Executive Director of the Ashland Independent Film Festival, and we are here with Renee Tajima-Peña, the director of My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, and also the recipient of this year's Rogue Award. We are also showing her film No Mas Bebés during the festival, and Renee will also be back on awards night for the awards presentation. So Renee, let's talk about My America, the film people just saw. Tell us a little bit more about the story behind the road trip, and particularly maybe you're finding Victor Wong and deciding to make him the central character of your movie.
Well, there's a personal story and then there's a bigger story. So the personal story really is I discovered America as a child because my father, who had this wanderlust, would just pile us all in the Buick LeSabre, I think it was, one of those big boat kind of cars. And we would just take road trips every summer, you know. And at that time, Route 66, I mean, we lived in Chicago, and, you know, we would go east and we would go west. And it was interesting because as a Japanese American growing up in the 1960s and 70s, there were very, very few of us at that time, very few Asian Americans, period. So, you know, we'd go around the country and we'd never see any other Asian Americans. I mean, I remember it was late 60s, we saw a Japanese woman in the Appalachians in front of a store. It's like Tennessee or something. And my family still talks about it. I mean, we just saw her, but it was so shocking to see another Asian face on the road. So fast forward to the 1990s, and I guess the bigger story really was what's going on with Asian Americans at that time. So after the 1965 immigration reforms, it opened up new immigration to mostly people from Asia, Latin America, you know, a lot of immigrants from China, from Mexico, from, you know, very different immigrants from the European wave of European immigrants. And it just, you know, the Asian American population just grew exponentially. So we are now, and by that time, we were the fastest growing population in the country. So it changed everything. It changed everything about our identity, who we were. We went from being primarily just Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino, that was the vast majority of us, to having dozens and dozens of different language groups and nationalities. And when I was young, I had come up as a student activist in the Asian American movement, and we identified ourselves as Asian Americans, or this very particular group of people who had a common immigration history, common labor immigration history mostly. And all of a sudden we're just so different. You know, you had people coming in who, because of the rise of Asian economies, you might have somebody who is a business person with a home in Hong Kong and San Francisco and Paris. And then you had a lot of new immigrants and refugees who were coming in who, you know, had a hard time finding jobs. Maybe they didn't have even like indigenous literacy where, you know, in their homelands. So you had this beginning of what is now really this barbell socioeconomic graph of Asian Americans, where you have some people who are very privileged, some even might be in the 1%. And then you have others who have been left behind, and you have this like real disparity. So by the 1990s, we're really starting to see this growing diversity of Asian Americans. And in the United States, people were really talking about, you know, the United States, this oncoming new American majority, where people of color were going to be by 2040 or 2050, they were saying, the majority population in this country. And people were talking about, you know, what does it mean to be an American, period. So those two things, the personal kind of wondering, you know, what does America look like for Asian Americans today? And, you know, this thirst for being on the road. and just what was happening around us that became My America or Honk If You Love Buddha.
And so,
sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that's fascinating. Thanks for that background. So the form you discovered, this really is an essay film. It's different, and it's an autobiographical film too. I imagine a lot of it was constructed in the editing, I'm gathering, you know, coming up with the threads. But one thing that ties it together is Victor Wong, and he himself ties together several threads. How did you land on him?
It's just as you see in the film. I thought he was in Chan is Missing. So
Yeah.
Chan is Missing was Wayne Wong's breakout film from 1981. And Wood Moy, you know, I thought he was a great character, and they do look alike. So I thought, oh, this is the guy who played, you know, the taxi driver in Chan is Missing. And then I went to, he was living actually in Sacramento. His new partner had a daycare center, if you can imagine that Victor hanging out in a daycare center. He was like a big, I guess, teddy bear, or, you know, he was really entertaining for the kids. But I went to see him, and then I, you know, realized when I looked at him, I said, oh, like, this is not the guy. But he started telling me stories about his life. And actually, so his stories were so colorful, I didn't believe him. But then when I would film with him, you know, we'd go like in San Francisco's Chinatown, just walk around, and everybody knew him. And they would start talking about the same stories from his past. And I said, you know, this guy it's stranger than fiction. I mean, his life is stranger than fiction. So, so he became the heart and soul of the anchor of the road trip. He didn't travel with me, but he was sort of like this, you know, spiritual guru.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting how he connects some of the threads. I mean, one of them being, and that really strikes me now as a major thread running through this film, is the intersectionality of Asian Americans and particularly African Americans as a major subject of this film. Victor and his African American wife, Bill McNeary, the civil rights activist, the hip hop duo Psycho Mike MC. Again, that seems to be a major theme kind of that runs through this. You want to say anything about that?
Well, you know, partly because I grew up in a neighborhood that was, you know, very integrated, had a big African American as well as Asian American community population. So I grew up very much around Black culture, and that is, you know, was true of a lot of Asian Americans. I mean, if you look at my generation, many of us grew up in segregated neighborhoods because in the 1940s, 1950s, even 1960s, there were restrictive covenants and then redlining. So a lot of like Japanese Americans around Los Angeles, a lot of people lived in like Boyle Heights, which is a Mexican American neighborhood. They lived in around Crenshaw, Limerick Park, and Baldwin Hills. And it was because of that, you know, redlining, and because of, I mean, my uncle, when I was making my recent series, Asian Americans, before my dad passed, we were driving around our neighborhood, and he pointed to another neighborhood nearby. He said, oh yeah, your Uncle Ted desegregated that neighborhood because, you know, Japanese could otherwise not live in certain, you know, white neighborhoods. But there was a Jewish realtor who was opposed, you know, he just didn't believe in racist housing laws or housing practices. And he wanted to make sure a Japanese American family could move into the house they wanted to live in. So that's why my Uncle Ted and his family were able to live in that part of Pasadena, California. But you know, it ended up being, he ended up living at first it was a mainly Japanese and African American neighborhood. It was a segregated neighborhood. And you know, that's something we talk about a lot today that's really in the conversation. of race and, you know, the fault lines of race that extend back to when we first came here. And that, you know, there's been that racial hierarchy that was established like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We have white on top, black on the bottom, and Asians occupying what the writer Jeff Chang calls this in-between space, these different gradations.
You have the Filipinos, Filipino Americans identifying themselves as more white than other Asian Americans.
Yeah, well, when Asian Americans first came here, because they were banned from citizenship, even banned from immigrating, they had to try to claim whiteness in order to have legal status here. So it's a very long, complicated relationship. But then there are also, just specifically with African Americans, there's a whole kind of history of solidarity. So you have like Frederick Douglass, who denounced the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Or you have, in the Marcus Garvey movement, actually the editor of Negro World, Marcus Garvey's newspaper, was East Indian. He was a South Asian immigrant. So those solidarities go back, you know, many, many years, even though the conflict and tension has been the more predominant narrative.
One of the things that struck me watching it this time was that with the recurrence of African-American, Asian-American interactions woven through the film, at the very end, the film kind of takes a surprise turn. You marry a Mexican-American, and the comment is, I can't think of anything to say on the subject. But I was wondering if you might be able to think of something to say now. I mean, given looking back at your filmmaking career and the fact that you have alternated making your films mostly on Asian American and Latin American, that is, you know,
Mexican American.
Calavera Highway, Mas Bebes, and The New Immigrants has been about Latin immigrants to the U.S. You want to say something about that particular intersection, which again only comes up at the very end of My America?
Yeah, I mean, I married my husband Armando because we fell in love, and we actually I grew up in a very integrated neighborhood, as I said, and there were also a lot of Chicanos who lived in our neighborhood. So, I mean, it was sort of a blessed time because that integration before white flight, you know, it's not like we all got along, but we went to school together and, you know, I mean, that's the only way to do it. You have to have direct contact with people to not fear them. So, you know, by the time I met my husband, I mean, I had just, you know, had partners of all different races. And he spent a lot of his life in California because he went to graduate school here. He actually lived in a Japanese American neighborhood, Sawtelle, which is near UCLA, where he went to grad school. So, you know, he ate what I ate and he was comfortable. I mean, we were just comfortable with each other because we both had these, you know, interethnic ties already. And so in terms of the films, I mean, the first film I made with the Latinx content was a film about Armando, and I made it with Armando. It's about his family story, also a road trip, very much like My America. It was called Calavera Highway. After his mother passed, her ashes were with us, and he and his brother took her ashes to see all of their brothers who lived along what was, for them, in childhood, the migrant trail from where they grew up in Texas to California and up to Washington State. So that was, you know, that was a personal project with my husband. The New Americans, which I made with Cartemquin Films, were part of the series. I actually, with Evangeline Griego, made what we call the Mexican story, following a family from Mexico as they immigrated to the U.S. and resettled in Kansas. But that was a project that Vanjie and I started as a multi-ethnic project. So we also had a Vietnamese family. We had one Mexican family, one Vietnamese family. And as it turned out, and we even shot in Vietnam for it, but then we could just never raise the money to do both stories for the series. So we did the Flores family, the Mexican family story. And then No Mas Bebés also, it was a project that Virginia Espino, the co-filmmaker, brought to me. She's my neighbor. And everything's so personal, actually. So she's my neighbor, and when our kids are the same age, so when they were little, we'd have play dates and talk about our work. And we actually live only a few miles from the hospital where these Mexican immigrant women in No Mas Bebés, who we documented No Mas Bebés, were sterilized coercively. And she told me about her research as a historian and about the story. And then, you know, I was a new mother, and I said, God, you know, someday we've got to make a film about this. So, you know, years later, we made No Mas Bebés.
Mm-hmm. So, Renee, you called this film My Search for Asian America, and now, a little over 20 years later, you've produced this groundbreaking series for PBS that's playing right now called Asian Americans, which presents the outlook of Asian American filmmakers on the Asian American experience. And that makes me think that of the fact that one of the reasons we're honoring you, besides your glorious film career, is that besides making films, you've been instrumental in building organizations to support Asian American independent filmmakers, including Asian Cinevision, which you ran, and the Center for Asian American Media, which is also now involved in the producing of the Asian American series. So I'm just wondering, just looking back to the period when you made Who Killed Vincent Chin through My America, what was that period like for Asian American indie filmmakers, and how does it compare to today?
Well, it's, you know, in the early 1980s when I started working on Who Killed Vincent Chin, we were just forming Center for Asian American Media. At that time, it was called NATA, like a long name I won't even repeat. But, you know, the only way we've gotten anywhere really is organizing and advocating for ourselves as an Asian American filmmaking community. So that was like one of the early formations. Also, there was visual communications out here in the West Coast, and, you know, different pods of seminal, like early Asian American filmmaking. But so Center for Asian American Media, we formed that, became very strong. And, you know, up to today, a few years ago, two of the filmmakers that I work with on the Asian American series, Leo Cheng and Grace Lee, who are amazing filmmakers, launched a organization called ADOC, the Asian American Documentary Network. And within a few years, we had like hundreds and hundreds of documentary filmmakers. And it's the same ideas. We wanted to, you know, advocate for Asian Americans in the field of documentary filmmaking. And we also wanted to mentor new documentary filmmakers, because the bar to entry for any documentary filmmakers is really high. You know, pay is low. There are a lot of trust fund babies who are able to make films. And, you know, if you don't have your own independent resources, it's just really, really hard. So, you know, we wanted to, as people who had already been established in the field, you know, gathering other people, other peers of our peers, and we wanted to pass it on to younger generations of filmmakers.
Well, maybe now, just to finish up, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about the Asian American series and the importance of the series, and also its, I have to say that the topicality for this moment where we're seeing a renewal or a rise in the scapegoating of Asian Americans around this COVID-19 crisis.
Well, even before the COVID-19 crisis, we wanted to look at the fault lines of race and immigration and xenophobia in Asian American history since, you know, we first started immigrating to this country. So, you know, if you look at those fault lines, they erupt during times of crises. And in the history that we tell, we see those eruptions in, you know, World War II for Japanese Americans. Like my family was incarcerated during World War II. If they weren't in the U.S. military, they were behind barbed wire. During the 1950s, during the Cold War and the fall of China, Korea, and the Vietnam to communism, the Chinese Americans were entangled in the witch hunts, the McCarthy witch hunts, in New York's Chinatown, San Francisco's Chinatown, all around the country. In 1982, Vincent Chin case, which was my first film, Who Killed Vincent Chin, documented that during the auto recession in Detroit, when Japanese car imports were blamed, Japanese people and anybody who looked Japanese was scapegoated as well with racial violence. After 9/11, South Asian Americans also were scapegoated with, there were murders and racial violence and racial profiling. So, but it's not, I have to say the series is not all, tales of conflict and woe. It's really about how Asian Americans have responded as artists, have responded by challenges in the courts. Even in the 1800s, there were Chinese immigrants who were, like Wong Kim-ark, he was a restaurant worker, denied reentry into the United States, even though he was a citizen. He was born in San Francisco. He took his challenge to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. So if you're the child of immigrants, you are a citizen because of Wong Kim-ark. That's why my parents are citizens, and their kids being born today who are children of citizens. Children of immigrants are being born right now as we speak because of Wong Kim-ark, and they'll be U.S. citizens. So now we find ourselves in another crisis, and we kind of see the same, scapegoating flare up, but we also see the same kind of response. ADOC sponsored it wasn't really a contest, but we invited people in our community to make short films about the COVID crisis. And they're really, the first three are out. One is by Valerie So, who's a longtime filmmaker. And she made a beautiful little film about how she's with all these groups of other Asian Americans sewing masks and to give away to first responders. It's really beautiful film. And then there was another film made about a Hmong elected official in Minnesota, and he does story time, but he also talks about how important it is to unite during the COVID crises, and he talks about his community. They're just really beautiful films with a lot of spirit to it, and that's the series itself. If you look at My America, even though it addresses some difficult topics of race and racism, it's really joyful. And the Asian American series, even though there are a lot of hard-hitting themes that we address, to me, it's very inspirational to see how people over the years just, they stood up.
Well, thank you, Renee, for letting us show your films. I hope people will check out your other films as well, the ones you've mentioned, Who Killed Vincent Chin, Calavera Highway, and others. And also, people, you have my permission to depart from the film festival and go to pbs.org to see Asian Americans, which is running free there through mid-June, and then will be on PBS Passport and available. So again, thank you, Renee, for being here.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks. Bye.